Hello, and welcome to Obscure History. When we last left our narrative, the Seleucid Empire appeared to be on the ascendancy once more, with the boundless energy of the charismatic king Antiochus IV Epiphanes driving the state forwards. Seemingly unstoppable, he saw the general revival of Seleucid supremacy, even adding new territory to boot in the form of Egypt and Cyprus. For a time, it looked as if he would match the deeds of his father, Antiochus III Megas, but it was not meant to be. During his own eastern anabasis, Antiochus IV mysteriously met his end in the winter of 164 BC, whilst putting things to right in the eastern satrapies. Thanks to this sudden and unexpected development, the general Lysias, left behind in Syria to deal with the ongoing Maccabean revolt, had to abandon the field of battle to the rebels under Judas Maccabeus. News of the Mad King's death would further embolden the Maccabees, and Lysias's sudden departure provided them a needed respite to prepare for the further conflict which was to follow. Whilst not ideal, Lysias's retreat was a necessary move if he was to stand any chance of assuming full control of the government back in Antioch. The old king's son, also named Antiochus, was now the next in line for the throne, but being too young to rule in his own right, he required a strong regent that could guide the ship of state out from the uneasy waves it found itself surrounded in. The empire now once again stood on a knife's edge. So please join me as we continue our usual program of battles, political intrigue, and some interesting history. By the start of 163 BC, Lysias managed to safely return to Antioch with his portion of the army, successfully taking up the mantle of regent to the young Antiochus. The boy's father had declared him to be raised and looked after by Lysias as one of his final commands before the journey eastwards, but the general of Syria knew he could trust few to uphold this wish. Soon after Lysias's return, the 9-year-old was crowned as Antiochus V Eupator. The nickname meant of a noble father, honouring Antiochus IV. Of course, none of this changed the fact that the real power behind the throne was now Lysias. Soon after the coronation, the court at Antioch received the recognition of Antiochus V as king from the Roman Senate, seemingly bolstering the legitimacy of the current regime. The Romans, for their part, had other motives to recognize the child as king, but we will get to this later. For most of the remaining year, Lysias would continue settling internal affairs. Meanwhile, out in the east, the other half of the Seleucid royal army was not standing idly by. Whilst Antiochus IV was on his deathbed, he summoned an army officer by the name of Philip to his side, entrusting him with the royal regalia so that it could be passed on to his young son. It seemed that Philip interpreted this dying wish in a very different way, however, thinking that Antiochus had empowered him to take over the regency from Lysias. Now directionless and manipulating the situation to his advantage, Philip commanded the slow march of this half of the army back towards Syria to contest the regency. Elsewhere in the empire, things were not looking good. The satrap of Media, Timarchus, a man who you may remember as being appointed to the post by Antiochus IV, now began acting independently from the central Seleucid authorities. No discernible reason is given by our sources as to why Timarchus rose up in rebellion, but here is my take on it. After spending many years holding back increasing Parthian aggression, he must have found his available resources rather strained. His satrapy of Media had a strong cavalry tradition, but this would not have been enough to match the more numerous Parthian horse archers. The region of Hyrcania was still under Seleucid control, but only just barely. Under their ambitious ruler, Mithridates I, the Parthians recently conquered the areas of Aria, Margania, and the western part of Bactria from the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Timarchus received little aid from Antiochus IV, for that king spent most of his reign being too busy concerned with the western half of his empire, an example of this being the multiple attempts at conquering Egypt from the Ptolemies. It was not until the final few years of his rule that he began to actually take notice of the eastern half of the empire, and if you ask me, this prospect of finally getting support was the only thing holding Timarchus back from rebelling any sooner. Seeing the alarming progress the Parthians were making, he would have been desperate to receive aid by the time the news of Antiochus's death reached him. The sudden departure of the royal army under Philip was the last straw in this festering resentment. Modern scholars approach Timarchus with some skepticism. We aren't really sure if he wanted to assert control over the entire empire, although his later capture of territory in Babylonia would suggest he had this ambition. He was even successful in gaining recognition from Rome as an independent king, most likely done to further weaken the Seleucid state. The territory he directly controlled is uncertain, as it may have been just Media, but my suspicion is that he controlled all the remaining Seleucid territory east of the Zagros Mountains. His assumption of the title Vasileus Megas, Great King, was his way of attempting to rally support from the native population. This is due to the title's links to the Achaemenid Persians. This was also in imitation of Eucratides, who had become king of the Greco-Bactrians in 171 BC, with Timarchus even adopting the same coin design of the Dioscuri brothers on horseback. What we do know is that Timarchus's revolt received substantial support from the Armenian king Artaxerxes, who himself was able to break away from the Seleucids once more, along with his client kingdom of Sophene. This was the same Artaxerxes who had been humiliated by Antiochus IV only a few years prior, so he naturally held no real loyalty to the man or his heir. The region of Media Atropatani also declared their independence once more at around the same time. To add a bitter cherry on top, the small region of Commagene, which bordered Syria to the north, also broke away from Antioch under its satrap Ptolemaeus. He had served dutifully in this post since the days of Antiochus III, all the way through the reigns of Seleucus IV and Antiochus IV. Now deciding to become Commagene's first king, he declared the city of Samosata as his new capital, claiming his familial links to Darius I of the Persian Empire. This ancestral boast has been preserved in fragmentary inscriptions found by archaeologists atop Mount Numrud, one of the highest points of the Taurus mountain range. Given time, Ptolemaeus' descendants would even marry into the Seleucid house despite breaking away from the empire. Lysias must have received reports of these breakaway states and would have been eager to return some semblance of order, but further news arrived in Antioch that would draw his attention back south. By the middle of 162 BC, the regent and his ward received an audience from Jerusalem, who presented the latest developments that had recently taken place there. As already mentioned, Judas and his forces, elevated by the sudden departure of the Seleucid royal army, marched to Jerusalem itself, where they began putting things to right by restoring the traditional ways of Jewish worship. Whilst the majority of the city's inhabitants were pretty happy with this arrangement, there was still the minority held up within the Acra fortress that still defied the rebels. When the Maccabees made numerous attempts to make sacrifices within the Second Temple, they were rebuffed each time when the garrison continually sallied out to kill them. Determined to drive the Gentiles and traitors out, Judas committed his forces to a siege of the Acra, surrounding it with earthworks and siege weapons. Despite their best efforts to cut off the fortress, some of the entrapped people managed to make good their escape by night and had safely made it all the way to Syria, seeking aid from the Seleucid court directly. The Jewish historian Josephus has the party explain to the king that they did not deserve to suffer at the hands of their own countrymen, and that their very suffering was done in the name of the king's father, for they dutifully followed his command to abandon their ancestral religion in exchange for the Hellenic pantheon of gods. They warned the king and Lysias that unless immediate assistance was rendered, the Acra would fall with the death of the defenders inside all but assured. Josephus then conjures up an image of the child king going into a fit of rage upon hearing the news, summoning his friends and advisors to gather mercenaries and all men of military age throughout the kingdom to answer the call to arms. Frankly, I would be surprised if the 9-year-old boy even fully understood what was really happening around him. On a side note, Ptolemy Macron, the Ptolemaic governor of Cyprus turned traitor to the Seleucids, found himself accused in front of the king by his royal advisors. The charge brought before him was one of treason yet again, for he allegedly held sympathetic views towards the Jews during his tenure as the governor of Collier, Syria and Phoenicia. With his benefactor now dead, Ptolemy became an easy target for the other members of the court. Perhaps some of them were jealous of his position as governor over the important and rich trading cities of Phoenicia. Jealousy mixed in with the fact that the man who had betrayed his paymaster once could easily do so a second time was probably what drove the court to now openly turn against him. Unable to rise above the accusations, and probably on the orders of the regent himself, Ptolemy Macron departed this world by committing suicide through poison. For now, Lysias was comfortable giving the orders, but too many wrong moves could easily see him in the position of Ptolemy. Lysias now had a real dilemma on his hands, having to choose which crisis to address first. The following is not exactly recorded, but some further speculation here makes sense of his ultimate decision-making. Realizing the more imminent threat was to the south in Judea, he decided that the Maccabean revolt had gone on for too long and had to be put down in earnest. Unless he knew the exact designs that Philip had on the Regency, then to Lysias's mind there was nothing to fear from the returning half of the army from Persis. Logically, without the king being present, it made sense for them to return to the capital in order to receive new instruction. With regards to Timarchus, perhaps he hoped that the harsh terrain of the Zagros Mountains, along with the garrisons of cities such as Babylon and Seleucia on the Tigris, would deter the rebellious satrap from launching a westward campaign anytime soon. With the rest of the royal army assembled, Lysias personally took charge once more. Accompanying him would be young Antiochus himself, no doubt a move engineered to keep the regent's key to power close and secured. In time, it would serve as a rude awakening for the young boy to the realities of keeping an empire together. The strength of this Seleucid army varies wildly depending on your preferred source. Maccabees 1 describes a force of 100,000 foot, 20,000 horsemen, and 32 of the famous Seleucid war elephants. Maccabees 2 proposes that there were 80,000 men with an unspecified number of horsemen. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing sometime after the events, gives us the most reserved set of numbers of 50,000 foot, 5,000 cavalry, and 80 elephants, which most modern historians tend to be favourable towards, although the number of elephants was probably far fewer, between 8 and 30. Regardless of the real-life figures, the size of the force made a formidable royal army, matching the likes of prior forces fielded under past Seleucid rulers. The force setting out from Syria was surely more than a match against anything Judas could possibly muster. Both Maccabees 1 and Josephus describe how the Seleucids took an unconventional approach towards Jerusalem in order to catch the rebels off guard. Going through Mount Hebron, which bordered the southwest of Judean territory, the Seleucids crossed over and laid siege to the rebel-held fortress of Beth-Zur. Much of Lysias's time was consumed here as the rebels continually sallied out to burn the siege equipment, but eventually the irritable fortress fell. When Judas received word that the new Seleucid king and his regent had brought an army into Judea from the south, he abandoned his siege on the Acra, much to the relief of the defenders there. Whilst the fall of Beth-Zur was nothing to celebrate, it did give the main Maccabean force time to fully assemble. Rather than rely on the proven hit-and-run tactics which worked in prior engagements, Judas instead positioned his force of between 10 and 20,000 men on the high ground near the road to Jerusalem. The reason behind this was due to the Maccabees needing to cede the south of Judea, including Jerusalem itself, to the Seleucids, unless, of course, they made a more concrete stand. Our sources also mention that the previous year's harvest was rather poor, with unrest between Greek and Jewish communities being a big contributor towards this. The problem was further compounded by refugees flooding in from the outer areas of the region due to the same unrest, resulting in the real possibility of widespread regional famine. With two large armies also thrown into the mix, both sides knew that a quick engagement was necessary. All the pieces had now fallen into place for the upcoming battle of Beth-Zachariah, fought in May of 162 BC. Out of all the sources that describes the engagement, Maccabees 1 is generally considered the most reliable. Some of the details available could only have been obtained from either a direct eyewitness to the events, or at the very least, the author was able to interview people who were actually present. Along with the figures already given for the Seleucid army, Maccabees 2 also mentions 300 chariots being present, but this seems to be a dubious claim, for the mostly uneven terrain of Judea would render these completely obsolete. Maccabees 1 describes the morning routine of the army as they prepared for the coming fight. Quote, "Early in the morning, the king arose and took his army by a forced march along the road to Beth-Zachariah, and his troops made ready for the battle and sounded their trumpets. They showed the elephants the juice of grapes and mulberries to arouse them for battle. They distributed the beasts among the phalanxes. With each elephant they stationed 1,000 men, armed with coats of mail, and with brass helmets on their heads, and 500 picked horsemen were assigned to each beast. These took their position beforehand. Wherever the beast was, wherever it went, they went with it, and they never left it. And upon the elephants were wooden towers, strong and covered. They were fastened upon each beast by special harness, and upon each were 4 armed men who fought from there, and also its Indian driver. The rest of the horsemen were stationed on either side, on the 2 flanks of the army, to harass the enemy, while being themselves protected by the phalanxes. When the sun shone upon the shields of gold and brass, the hills were ablaze with them, and gleaming like flaming torches." Of course, when the source says the king gathered the army and forced marched them to the site of battle, they really meant the region Lysias, but no clear distinction between the two is given throughout. The pathway leading to the Maccabean position of Beth-Zachariah was a narrow one leading to a plateau. The hammer had chosen his ground well, for the narrowness of the pathway would help cancel out the Seleucid numerical advantage. Regardless, Lysias continued to feel confident and commanded the main bulk of the Seleucid horse, along with skirmishing units, to ascend the hills on either side of the passage. This move would better safeguard against possible ambushes, whilst also giving a sizable portion of the army a better survey of the battlefield, allowing for a quicker and more orderly response as the situation unfurled. Within the passage itself marched the light infantry, who could remove any obstacles for the rest of the force. Behind them lumbered the gargantuan elephants, the prime symbol of Seleucid power. As mentioned within the quote, the heavy infantry, including the phalangites, were interspersed in between them. When the rebels were in sight, the Seleucid light infantry let out a battle cry that echoed throughout the valley. Josephus and Maccabees I describe how much of the rebel force became demoralized by this, whilst also seeing the magnitude of their numbers. Managing to steady his men's nerves, Judas met the enemy charge with his own, slaying 600 of the Gentiles. A famous account is then recorded at this time, for one of Judas's younger brothers, named Eleazar, caught sight of one of the Seleucid elephants. Seeing the manner in which it was adorned in resplendent armor, he assumed that either Lysias or the king himself was mounted atop it. Charging through the phalanx protecting it, he fought on like a lion, coming face to face with the great beast. Sword in hand, he slid directly beneath the animal and thrusted his blade up into its belly. The act killed both man and elephant, for Eleazar was unable to move away in time, being crushed in the process. As it turned out, no one of significance was atop the great beast, and whilst it was an act of immense bravery, Eleazar's sacrifice was ultimately not enough to inspire the Maccabean force to press on. Once the heavy phalanx and the rest of the elephants made contact, they began mauling the lightly armed rebels. Taking to flight, the remaining Maccabees retreated further into the mountains, refusing to engage any further. The battle had been a decisive Seleucid victory. A few points regarding Judas's younger brother are worth briefly analysing. Many modern historians are skeptical on the heroics of Eleazar during the battle. Firstly, they rightfully point out that the boy king would never have been placed in such mortal danger atop the elephant, and that when the Seleucid monarchs did appear on the battlefield, they were always on horseback, following the tradition of Alexander the Great. Secondly, whilst the slaying of an Indian elephant in the heat of battle makes for an inspiring tale, it is probably not wholly truthful. The elephant is described as being killed instantly, but even if the blade managed to pierce a vital organ, it would have taken hours for the animal to bleed out, and definitely would not have resulted in its immediate collapse. It is probable that the elephant did eventually die of its mortal wounds, but we sadly know from more modern tales of elephant hunting that they are not quick or easy to take down, and that's with the use of modern technology to boot. Some historians believe that the whole tale is simply just that, a tale made up in order to inspire generations of Maccabees to continue the struggle, even from a clear defeat. The slaying of the elephant is akin to the decline of the Seleucid Empire in general, which admittedly is an easy claim to make with hindsight, but there might be some truth to it given how prized they were as an asset and symbol to the royal house itself. Finishing off the stragglers, Lysias marched the army and laid siege to the rebels still within Jerusalem. The Seleucids were able to field all manner of siege engines, including ballista and catapults, with the Jews also setting up their own in retaliation to defend their most holiest of places. However, whilst all this was going on, the issue of food shortages soon reared its ugly head again as both the defenders and the besiegers began to starve to death. On top of this, Lysias received news that the army officer Philip had declared himself the rightful regent in Antioch, threatening his position. Peace talks were soon agreed by both sides, which favoured the Jews. On behalf of the king, Lysias agreed to end the siege, with the Maccabees promising to not besiege the Acra anymore. He also repealed all of Antiochus IV's policies around conversion, allowing the people of Judea the freedom of worship, as had been before that mad king's meddling. Maccabees 2 states that the nominal high priest Menelaus was put to death once Lysias told the king that the man had been directly involved in the rebellion's outbreak. He was sent to the city of Beoria, where he was thrown into a tower of ashes, sinking to the bottom, unable to breathe. The author clearly sees this as divine retribution for his part in the 171 sack of Jerusalem, poetically drowning in the ashes which represented the partial destruction of the holy city, with the punishment being made famous by the Achaemenid Persians. Once the oath of truce took place, the Seleucids somewhat backtracked on their deal by tearing down sections of the city wall, as to make the city less defensible in future. Leaving Judea behind with haste, Lysias's force began its journey northwards along the Phoenician coastline, stopping off at various cities to resupply. When they reached the port city of Ptolemais, the citizens protested in outrage at the peace deal Lysias had crafted with the Maccabees, for they had sent a raiding force during the fighting and demanded that justice be had. The regent was able to calm the situation, probably offering some form of compensation in order to calm the people's nerves. Marching inland, Lysias and his army soon arrived in Syria, reaching the outskirts of Antioch. Little is actually recorded regarding the episode involving Philip, but it seems he was able to secure the city whilst the real regent was absent. Maccabees 1 states how he, quote, found Philip in control of the city, but fought against him and took the city by force, which gives the impression that the standoff between the two halves of the army did not last long. My suspicion is that as Lysias had young Antiochus in his possession, there may have been groups or individuals within Antioch that saw the writing on the wall. Philip losing the fight through treacherous means would go some way to explaining the brevity of what would have been a critical moment for the true regent, but all this is speculation. Whatever the method employed, the end result was the same, as we conveniently hear nothing more of the rogue army officer. At around the same time, Antiochus III's surviving daughter, Antiochus, arrived back in her ancestral home following the natural death of her husband, Ariarathes IV Eusebius, king of Cappadocia. By all accounts, the couple were happy enough together, producing a son and 2 daughters. The boy would succeed his father as King Ariarathes V Eusebius Philopator, whilst the eldest daughter, Stratonike, would end up becoming the wife of 2 kings of Pergamon. As the living daughter of Antiochus III, Antiochus would have wielded considerable influence despite only just arriving at the capital, and this would not have gone unnoticed by Lysias. If Polybius is to be believed, then both her and her other unnamed daughter were soon executed on the regent's orders. Fearful of the sway Antiochus held, he wanted to eliminate any source of possible rivalry to his authority. This makes sense for him to do, considering he just recently had to deal with Philip. Polybius's contemporaneous histories are invaluable to us, but it should be noted that for reasons which will become clear later on, Polybius had good reason to paint the regent in a negative manner. True or not, there is no further mention of Antiochus from any of our sources after this point. Ariarathes V, for his part, did not take the news of his mother and sister's sudden death very well, genuinely believing that Lysias had them both assassinated. Managing to hide his outrage publicly for the time being, he politely sent a petition to the regent, requesting the ashes of both women, which was granted. Lysias now had the situation in the capital under his control once more, but if he thought he was to receive a needed break, then he was sorely mistaken. Rome had dispatched a delegation to assess the geopolitics of the eastern Mediterranean, and they would soon find themselves at the very gates of Antioch. But before then, they held audience with the still distraught King Ariarathes V. The Cappadocian monarch allowed his anger to bear forth in front of the delegation, accusing Lysias of various atrocities against his family. Alarmed by this, the Romans gave their condolences and set off for Syria to speak with the regent himself. After warning them of Lysias's wicked ways, the king even offered an armed escort, but the Romans politely declined. The leader of this party was Gnaeus Octavius, and he was accompanied by Spurius Lucretius and Lucius Aurelius. Octavius was a decorated and respected war hero of the Third Macedonian War, fought between 171 and 168 BC. Being assigned to one of the consuls, his task was to win over the various leagues and city-states of mainland Greece in order to tilt the conflict in Rome's favour. More importantly, however, was his naval activities as praetor during the final year of the war, where his naval manoeuvring forced the Macedonian king, Perseus, to retreat to the plain near the settlement of Pydna, for fear he was to be cut off from his supply route. Rome's land army, of course, defeated the Macedonians in the pitched battle, where this major victory might not have been possible if Octavius's fleet hadn't positioned themselves in a way that made it appear they were trying to land behind Perseus's original position. The Senate recognized this major contribution and allowed Octavius a prominent position alongside Lucius Aemilius Paulus, who had been the consul for 168 and who had fought the Battle of Pydna. Octavius's star continued to shine bright, for he used his wealth and popularity from this conflict to be elected consul himself for the year of 165 BC. Needless to say, he was highly respected throughout Rome, and the reason why I have chosen to highlight Octavius's career will become apparent soon. It is safe to say that Lysias did not have the same easygoing charisma as Antiochus IV, and with the Romans already suspicious of him from their meeting with Ariarathes, the regent was already walking on thin ice. Utilizing his prior diplomatic experiences, Octavius chastised the regent for causing Ariarathes much grief, a point that Lysias probably protested his innocence to. Striking whilst the iron was hot, Octavius then cited the Treaty of Apamea and how that recent events had shown the Senate that the Seleucids were in clear violation of this. The treaty had first been put into force over 25 years by this time, so to the Seleucids, they naturally would have seen this as irrelevant to enforce, particularly with the limits on elephants and the fleet. The final amount of debt had also been paid off by Antiochus IV at the beginning of his reign, so the Seleucids rightfully concluded that the treaty had become null and void. This was clearly one of those surface-level pretexts that Rome was becoming infamous for using in order to further weaken the Seleucid realm as a whole, and Lysias was fully aware of this. Regardless of his personal opinions about the flimsy excuse, he had little choice but to concede to the demands that Octavius laid before him. He knew that Octavius carried the weight of the entire Roman Senate with him, and with that, the decision to threaten war should he wish to. Leaving the meeting, the Roman oversaw the hamstringing of all the Seleucid elephants, as well as the burning of the entire fleet. The Battle of Beth-Zachariah would prove to be the final conflict the Seleucids would face with their beloved pachyderms. Lysias was able to prevent the outbreak of war with Rome, but for many, the cost was far too high. Despite his battlefield victory over the Maccabees, his popularity drastically deteriorated, and by extension, so did Antiochus V's. With his work completed, Octavius earned himself some relaxation at the gymnasium. He apparently had no idea that his life was in danger. Whilst anointing himself with oils, a commoner by the name of Leptines of Laodicea, distressed by the senseless killing and burning of Seleucid pride, stabbed Octavius to death. The assassin was openly proud of his grisly accomplishment, going around the capital boasting of it. Being met with various cheers, other Antiochians began casually discussing the murder of the other two Roman envoys, showcasing their spirited nature, which will continue to crop up as time progresses. Lysias quickly learned of what was happening, and if his hair was not white before, then it certainly was now, although Leptines was not punished for his transgression, not severely anyway, for he makes an appearance a bit later on. Realizing he was now caught up in an international incident, the regent moved quickly to bury the murdered Octavius with as much respect as was possible to lessen the inevitable outrage from the Senate. Presumably, he escorted the other two emissaries under guard away from Syria, but Polybius does not mention this. Lysias then dispatched a delegation of his own to Rome, so that they could explain that this had happened as a consequence of one common individual, and that him and his government had nothing to do with the murder. With this mission sent on its way, the regent could only await the response in dread, rightfully expecting great reprisals from the expansive republic. The threat from Rome was indeed real. However, it would ultimately prove to not be from the Senate, but rather from another member of the Seleucid house, and our new protagonist. Enter Demetrius. The eldest son of Seleucus IV Eupator was first mentioned in passing within our narrative during episode 7. Born in 185 BC, Demetrius was only around 7 years old when his father packed him off to Rome, where he became a political hostage. Polybius states that the young prince kept a low profile during his first years of captivity. As he grew into a young man, he began to live more outwardly, taking particular joy in hunting the wildlife with his hounds around the hills near Circeii, just southeast of Rome. By 175 BC, his father had been assassinated by his chief minister, Diadorus, and when Demetrius had learnt of this, he plucked up the courage to address the Senate for the first time, demanding his birthright, which was denied. This, of course, led to his younger brother's murder at the hands of his uncle, Antiochus IV, who had by then usurped the throne, an arrangement that the Senate was all too happy to accept. When Antiochus V was proclaimed king in 164 BC, Demetrius once again sought out an audience with the Senate in the hopes that this time they would see sense. He rightfully argued that his claim to the Seleucid throne exceeded that of the young Antiochus V, for he and his father were not part of the main line within the family. Speaking at length, he tried to make a special appeal to the body of men, with Polybius stating, quote, "Rome was his fatherland and his nurse, that the sons of the senators were all like brothers to him, and the senators themselves like fathers, since he had come to Rome when quite an infant and was now 23 years of age." Many within the Senate chamber were moved by Demetrius's personal plea, but they ultimately chose once again to sweep him aside in favor of recognizing Antiochus V. The message was clear. Rome wanted the Seleucid realm to be ruled by a child and his regent rather than a young man in the prime of his life. Around the same time, Ptolemy VI Eupator had been spotted traversing towards Rome, following the breakdown in relations with his brother Ptolemy VIII Physcon. As a result, he was forced to flee, hoping the Republic would aid him. Along the way, Demetrius met up with his cousin, and seeing the ragged appearance of his attire, sent for better clothes befitting a Hellenistic Basileus to give to Ptolemy. The exiled pharaoh of Egypt thanked Demetrius but declined the offer, hoping that his appearance as a beggar would garner sympathy and support from the Senate. Not long after this, the news of Octavius's demise in Syria had reached Rome itself. Lysias's delegation arrived in front of a stone-faced Senate, who were by all accounts understandably furious at Octavius's fate. However, cooler heads were able to prevail, and when the Seleucids professed the innocence of both Antiochus V and Lysias in this matter, they were given no judgment or inclination as to what would happen. The excitement of what was taking place turned Demetrius into one of his hunting hounds as he rushed to speak with Polybius to seek his counsel on the issue. And yes, this is the same Polybius that we have been using as one of our primary sources on Seleucid history, and he just so happened to be friends with one of its eventual monarchs, hence my earlier disclaimer regarding the historian's probable bias against those who were against Demetrius. The historian was able to find common cause with the prince, for he too was also a political hostage of Rome following the conclusion of the Third Macedonian War. His father, Lycratas, had been a prominent landowner and statesman within the Achaean League in the Peloponnese, and for the first 30 years of Polybius's life, he was able to learn a lot from him. During the conflict with Rome, Lycratas had been elected strategos of the League, but practiced strict neutrality, preferring not to get involved in the war. This proved to be the wrong decision, however, as when Rome won against Perseus, they became suspicious of the Achaean League for not aiding them, and so demanded 1,000 hostages to ensure their good intentions. One of these hostages was of course the historian, who would have seen the younger Demetrius's circumstances as rather similar to that of his own, and so was happy to be an older friend to the young prince. When Demetrius told him of the events, he asked if he should go before the Senate again to stake his claim. As he puts it himself, quote, "Polybius begged him not to stumble twice on the same stone, but to trust in himself and take some bold course worthy of a throne. For he said, there were many opportunities for action suggested by the present situation." Understanding his elder friend's advice, the prince remained silent on the issue for a time, before asking another friend, Apollonius, for his opinion on what he should do. Apollonius advised the opposite, instructing Demetrius that he should go to the Senate once more, for even though they deprived him of his birthright twice, he should at least be released as a hostage, for it was unreasonable for him to remain so on behalf of the young child king Antiochus. Polybius puts Apollonius's viewpoint down to the ignorance of youth, but Demetrius became convinced by this reasoning and was soon before the Senate for a third time. The meeting went about as well as you could imagine, with the Senate still firmly resolved to keep Demetrius away from power. Only now did he finally understand that the Senate had no intention of releasing him from captivity, and that if he was to ever be free, he would need to take matters into his own hands. Tired of stumbling on Polybius's metaphorical stone, the prince called for a certain Diadorus, who had been Demetrius's foster father. Diadorus had recently returned from Syria on business, but whilst there, he managed to also grasp a general understanding of the current situation. He reported the mood in Antioch to be a sour one, with the populace now distrusting Lysias for allowing Octavius to bully him into complacency. Whilst not voicing it to the Seleucid envoys, the Senate suspected Lysias and his associates of being behind Octavius's murder. Demetrius only has to appear before the people, even if only accompanied by a single slave, and they would proclaim him the rightful ruler of the empire. Hearing everything he wanted, Demetrius decided that now was the time to seize his destiny. Turning to his older friend Polybius, he asked his aid in making good his escape. It just so happened that a man named Emilus of Alabanda was also in Rome, who had the friendship and trust of the historian. He was there on behalf of Ptolemy VI, but when Polybius introduced him to Demetrius and shared with him the plan to escape, Menelaus agreed to join the plot, promising a ship with full provisions ready to set sail. He was soon able to find an appropriate vessel that would fit the needs of the prince. The ship's origins was Carthaginian, and it carried special offerings bound for the Phoenician city of Tyre, for Carthage was originally a colony of this place, and the Carthaginians were honor-bound by tradition to send the offerings to their mother city each year. His escape vessel now secured, Demetrius now needed to simply disappear without raising the alarm. He sent Diadorus ahead of him back to Syria so that he had someone readily available to update him on the mood of the populace once he arrived. His friends and household were many, but he knew that he could only afford to bring a close-knit group on this journey. He brought Apollonius and his brothers Meleager and Menesthius into his confidence, who all eagerly agreed to the plan. These were the children of the Apollonius who had dutifully served Demetrius's father as one of his top generals and governors, and he'd retired to Miletus once Antiochus IV assumed power. The agreed day of the ship's departure had arrived. As agreed, Demetrius went to a friend's house in order to dine, giving him a reasonable excuse to leave his residence in Rome. Those individuals who were part of the escape would dine at their own homes, leaving to board the chosen ship with only a single attendant. Polybius tells us that he happened to be ill lying in bed on the day, but Menelaus kept him updated with what was occurring. Polybius was anxious that the banquet would go on for too long, owing to Demetrius's tendency of getting intoxicated when alcohol was involved. To ensure that his young friend would be sober enough for his quest, he wrote and sealed a short note and gave it to one of his slaves. The slave arrived at the banquet just after dusk and gave it to Demetrius's cupbearer, not informing him of who he was or what the message contained, only to deliver it to the prince as soon as possible. Handing Demetrius the note, he read the following lines. Quote, "The doer is away with all the tarrier's gear. Night favours all alike, but the most brave. Be brave and risk it, act to lose or win. Anything but give thyself away. Be sober and remember to distrust. These are the sinews of the mind." Understanding the subtext of the message and who it was from, Demetrius feigned being ill and left the banquet, being escorted by only a few friends and slaves who were not part of the plot. Arriving at a hut, he sent away the slaves that he had no need for, ordering them to assemble the nets and hounds for another hunt around Circeii. Once his slaves had left, Demetrius turned to Nicanor and his other friends and revealed the escape in its entirety. Once they had fully agreed to sign up, he instructed them to get back to their homes, ordering their slaves to join those of Demetrius's to help prepare for the hunt that was never to be. Assembled and ready, the youthful band made their way to the port of Ostia, where Menelaus, along with Apollonius and his brothers, were waiting with the chosen ship. The party of 16 soon boarded the ship after a short farewell from Menelaus. The sun began to rise in the distance, illuminating the shoreline, which was now becoming smaller and smaller the further the vessel sailed onwards. Demetrius must have looked back one final time at the place of his imprisonment for the last 16 years, thoughts racing through his mind. For the first day, no one had noticed the disappearance of the prince and his companions. The day afterwards, the slaves who were sent to Anagina to retrieve the hunting equipment arrived at Circeii, fully expecting Demetrius to be there. When they could not find him there, Some of them ran to Rome itself to question the remaining household he had left behind. After 4 days since his departure, some of the people began to suspect what had happened, and on the 5th, an emergency session of the Senate was held to discuss the matter. The idea of pursuing the rogue prince was quickly abandoned after rightfully reasoning that he would be too far away by now. Even if they somehow managed to track and catch up to him, they could not dissuade him from his current course of action. The best they could do was to send another commission out eastwards, in the hopes that they would learn of Demetrius's actions. Leaving Polybius in Rome, we turn to Josephus once more to find out what happened next. The Carthaginian vessel arrived off the Phoenician coastline by 161 BC. Stopping off at the port of Tripoli, Demetrius and his party disembarked onto the land of his ancestors for the first time since he was 7 years old. Although not explicitly mentioned by Josephus, the prince must have received the latest goings-on from his father-in-law. Finding the situation in Syria to still be to his advantage, Demetrius revealed himself to the people, proclaiming that he was their salvation from the tyrannical and untrustworthy rule of Lysias and his puppet child king. Continuing the trend set off by Antiochus IV, he placed a royal diadem around his own head, declaring himself the legitimate monarch to rule over the empire. Amassing a force of mercenaries, he entered Syria proper, being met with little to no resistance all the way to the capital. Everyone he came across eagerly joined his cause, hailing him as their true Basileus. Not long after his arrival in Antioch did he receive both Lysias and the boy alive and in chains. Lysias resigned himself to his fate, as Demetrius had the regent and child swiftly executed, much to the jubilation of the people. The move has a real sense of irony to it, for Demetrius had copied Antiochus IV in his method of disposing a child king. Only this time, Antiochus's own son was now Demetrius's victim. Deprived of his birthright no longer, the eldest son of Seleucus IV had finally set the record straight. At least, for now. Antiochus V is quite easy to assess, for he never grew old enough to be a proper force in his own right, having to rely on Lysias as his protector. Because of this, he is rightfully overlooked when it comes to Seleucid historiography. By extension, Lysias's tenure as de facto ruler of the empire is also mostly unremarkable, with the only exception to this being his handling of the war he had inherited with the Maccabees. Lysias has the distinction of commanding the last known elephants into battle as part of the Seleucid army, a distinction that he probably wouldn't want to be remembered by. His victory at Beth-Zachariah was sorely needed considering the mounting pressure elsewhere throughout the realm. But this was not the decisive victory that the Seleucids were hoping for, and the Maccabees would persist as an issue that Demetrius I would also have the joys of inheriting. Speaking of said pressure, Lysias did very little to alleviate any of them throughout his regency outside of the Maccabean revolt. This was mostly because he needed to be near enough to Antioch, as by now this was the centre of the empire, rather than the original centres of Seleucia on the Tigris and Babylon. Rivals such as Philip proved that Antioch could be swiftly taken without a proper defence to hand, so Lysias was always going to have at least one hand tied behind his back. More blame can and should be put at Lysias's feet for the region of Comagene breaking away from central control. The area had never attempted to break away before, but its satrap Ptolemaeus clearly saw Lysias's regency as fairly weak and ineffectual. The area was just to the north of Syria, making it a quick and easy opportunity to add another victory for Lysias, but he seems to have had no intention of checking the rebellious satrap, despite it being a modestly easy target. The same lack of response also appears to apply to Demarchus out in the east. Whilst this issue would have been more of a challenge to tackle, there is no mention in any of our sources of him actively putting anything in place to deter the satrap of Media from proclaiming independence. He made the same mistake that most prior Seleucid monarchs made, ignoring the east, which causes instability and chaos to that half of the empire. As we have seen, people have already recognized the fragile state of the Seleucid realm, but this will prove to only be the beginning of the storm. Ultimately, Lysias's regency must be described as an utter catastrophe for the empire. His passivity and inaction helped to accelerate the general decline of the realm, and the consequences of this must not be understated. His complacency to not stand up to Octavius's brash demands is what caused him to lose trust with the masses, costing Antiochus V's life and his own. He failed to keep his promise to Antiochus IV in protecting the boy, failing as a regent. Thank you as always for tuning in. It is always fun releasing a new video on the Seleucids, especially as we are getting into the later period, where the political intrigue and chaos starts to really ramp up. In the next episode, we will see what Demetrius I will do with his newly won authority as Basileus. Can he bring order to the inherited turmoil? If you have enjoyed what has been covered in this video, why not leave a like and a comment, or subscribe if you'd like to see more. The sources used for this video have been included in the video description. So until you hear the drums of war again, this has been Obscure History.